Since early Endwalker, the duty support system allowing you to run duties with a party of NPCs has been gradually expanded to cover not just the new duties, but also most, if not all, the old duties that predate the Trust and duty support systems. With patch 7.4, all A Realm Reborn leveling duties have received access to the duty support system, most of which having received minor to somewhat major tweaks in that same sweep, with MSQ relevant duties having had a much higher priority and the optional ones being resolved bit by bit throughout Dawntrail. I want to discuss these changes and reworks in order to perhaps reach a verdict whether these changes were good or bad. Was the old version better, or were these changes even warranted? Let's discuss. To begin, Zastasha, Tamtara Deepcroft, and the 3 Primal Trials among all these duties, as it turns out, received no changes, which perhaps also explains how especially Zastasha has kept all those optional side tracks and packs. Additionally, when Endwalker released, dungeon mobs were changed to no longer award any experience whatsoever, that experience roughly being moved to the bosses, which indirectly but heavily impacted how players approach running dungeons. For instance, when packs gave XP, if the entire party was in the appropriate level range, there could be a justification in actually, systematically clearing every room of mobs. Hilariously, sprouted seedlings in Aurum Vale gave 10 times more XP than the pods, so letting them stick around also made sense. With XP then only being awarded from bosses, the main justification for bothering with fighting packs at all is that they happen to be in the way. With these details out of the way, let's get to some comparisons, starting with Copperbell Mines, reworked in the 6.1 sweep. Some of the fire sand was moved around a bit, a few mobs in the hallway after the first boss were outright removed, however, they would reset when the party used the following elevator anyway, similar to many of the mobs in the first third of the dungeon, making these mobs somewhat redundant. Kotos! Originally, this fight was waves of mobs spawning far enough apart you couldn't really AoE them, and after a certain number of waves, the boss would doofily walk out of the cave hole above and just pop down into the arena. The boss mostly just auto-attacked, but would eventually attempt to cast Rampart, but it was stunnable. While the new version's symbol mechanics are much less exotic than the old version, a boss with a tank buster, some circle AoEs to avoid, a cone targeting a random player, and randomly targeted single target damage seems a lot more up the alley of more modern dungeon boss design, just at a slower pace to match with newer players. Originally, Ikaru's Ire had a monstrous amount of HP, making it essentially unkillable synced. A detonation device is placed in the arena, and using it summons a blasting cap mob. When this mob is near death, it will use self-destruct, which one-shots players, but if the boss is hit, it is split in half, massively reducing its HP, and enabling AoE damage, if available. Repeatedly splitting the boss until it is split into 8 small blobs makes it very weak and very killable. In the fight, at some point, a Spriggan would appear that would attack the blasting cap too. Again, the new version being tank buster and some circle AoEs is a lot closer to modern dungeon bosses, just simpler. Gyges the Great's old version was almost a striking dummy. He would run off to attack a wall to let his friends out, they would come out and then attack another wall for some sort of snowballing effect. However, as the boss didn't really do anything until that first wall was beaten, and power creep made it incredibly unlikely a wall would break before the boss, made this very simple. Again, the new version being tank buster and some circle AoEs, including something similar to so-called Shiva circles, should we call those Gyges circles now, is closer to modern dungeon boss design. To put it very bluntly, the old version of each boss in this dungeon were definitely more distinct and unique relative to most bosses in the game. However, the first boss boiled down to a mob rush, with the final mob just being slightly stronger. The second boss mostly boiled down to a lot of waiting. And the final boss effectively was relegated to a striking dummy due to power creep. I imagine there could be a way to spice up these fights without simplifying them to what they are now, But there's something to be said that making these early game bosses more similar to more modern bosses gives new players a better experience of learning mechanics that quote-unquote matter as they get further in the game. Halatali, reworked in 7.1. As far as packs go, no changes. The first boss used to be essentially a tanky basic mob, while sprites slowly moved towards a central bonfire. If these sprites made it to the bonfire, you took raid-wide damage, so obviously they get ignored, kill the boss. You may have heard this one before, but the new version has a tank buster, cone AoEs and a point-blank circle AoE. The second boss used to also mostly just auto-attack and at a certain HP threshold run out to the water, electrify it and summon adds, and return to the battle once the adds were dealt with. The new version has, say it with me now, a tank buster and a circle AoE. The water mechanic has been replaced with one long cast that does a lot of damage if you happen to be in the water when it resolves. The final boss used to mostly auto-attack and at thresholds become invulnerable and summon lines of sprites that when they reach him would explode for raid-wide damage. Simultaneously, a bigger sprite would spawn nearby and would be instantly replaced by one more on death until a certain number of them were killed, after which the boss becomes attackable again. The new version has a tank buster, an expanding circle AoE and a targeted circle AoE, and twice throughout does this invulnerability thing, but only the lines of sprites come in this version. Now, to be fair, a boss having a tank buster is extremely common and probably would almost seem weird compared to modern bosses if it didn't. But it does seem a little weird and strange when just auto attacks and a very weird mechanic is replaced with tank buster, one or two common AoE shapes, and a very simple version of that weird mechanic from before. Knowing that the second boss could be stunned on the way to its intermission to possibly rush it down before it happened at all tells me that the old version of Halatali, while quirky, was at a point where the quirky mechanics it had didn't even get to breathe in the first place, so replacing them with anything else was probably better than what was there. The thing that fights against this is more nostalgia than the desire for an interesting duty, in my opinion. 1000 Maws of Toto-Rak, reworked in the 6.1 sweep. A whole thing in the dungeon with multiple paths and at times relevant side paths to collect necessary items to proceed were all removed, and only one main path survived. Some unique environmental effects were also removed, like pod burst bombs littered throughout the last bit of the dungeon especially, and goop that slowed you down for running in it, as well as traps that dragged the first player to arrive forward and separated from the party with a web wall. The final boss was also changed to use pod burst bombs less. The saddest reality of the Toto-Rak rework was that it changed a duty with multiple options into one with just one. Due to the way players tend to approach running dungeons in 14, offering multiple paths mainly leads to opportunities for disagreements, even if the two options are largely equal in value. It is worth mentioning that, at least in my personal experience, someone actually raising an objection if the tank ran a different route than that individual preferred was exceptionally rare. But at the same time, parties tended to gravitate towards a specific solution, so disagreements were very rare anyway. Not to mention that this behavior also meant that the alternative paths mostly just existed to confuse first-timers, while for the rest, them being missing is mostly a problem because they used to be there. That of course doesn't mean that they couldn't have stayed. Haukke Manor, reworked in the 6.1 sweep. Originally, the teleporter in the cellar that sends you back to the entrance didn't exist, and you simply had to use return or walk back, which often left first-timers confused. Aside from that, only the final boss was changed. For a bit of comparison's sake, the Unchanged from the ARR version first boss has, you know the words, a tank buster, a circle AoE, and a point-blank AoE. So it's not like all the ARR bosses didn't follow this pattern that we're moving to now. The old version of Lady Amandine frequently lit 4 lamps in the corners of the room that would pulse party-wide damage every few seconds. They could be turned off by interacting with them, which itself was a bit janky as the damage from the lamps could interrupt you too. Throughout the fight, she summons bombs that can self-destruct, handmaidens that attack and use stone skin on the boss, as well as a mana sentry that can use a gaze mechanic. The idea was that everything had to be gradually dealt with, but with power creep, healers were generally capable of healing through the lamp damage, so you could ignore them, and the boss would not be able to summon the adds fast enough to justify players actually dealing with them. Maybe stun a maiden to prevent it from stone skinning the boss, and just keep smacking away. By comparison, today's version summons the mana sentry as a mechanic and not as an add, but a single handmaiden will also spawn to use stone skin as is tradition. The boss also has a more elaborate mechanic where she teleports to a side and charms the party to try and force them to look at the sentry gaze. Although, again, you can often skip that now. For this boss rework, I personally much prefer the old version, and it would have been cooler if they adjusted the mechanics to fit and adjusted numbers so the boss got to do its thing. The whole thing about the old version was overwhelming the party with tasks. The lamps, the bombs, the maidens, the sentry. The boss itself didn't do that much on its own. The lamps could have been made cleaner by having you need to stand in a circle for a bit to turn it off instead of interacting with it as an example. Brayflox Longstop from the 6.1 sweep. Some packs were moved around, mainly in the open space before the Mud Puppy boss. The arena for the final boss was changed to a simple circle from a more naturally shaped one. It used to have a mechanic where it would drop persistent poison puddles on player locations. What made it stand out is that the boss itself would heal if it stood in the poison puddle. This mechanic was reworked to circle AoE patterns instead. Due to the awkwardness of repositioning the boss, parties would surprisingly often just deal with it and keep attacking the boss to overwhelm the healing it received rather than bother moving away from the mechanic, which meant that whether the puddle landed near the dragon or not was mostly a random chance and just made the fight sometimes randomly annoying to deal with. I feel like simplifying this to just circle patterns is a bit extreme, and personally I would have preferred if the mechanic was just made more consistent. Maybe just place the puddles under the boss so you have to move it. But that would also be awkward, of course. Sunken Temple of Qarn, reworked in 7.2. Originally, the weird stone heads would chase you down and you had to awkwardly position them so they died on the glowing platform to open the door. If you failed, the head would simply rise up again until you got it right. Nowadays, the heads have been stapled to their platforms. It was an interesting gimmick in the duty, but for a lot of players, after, say, the second or third time, the janky mob collision, sometimes shuffling the head off its platform right when it died, just made the whole thing annoying, because it felt like failing due to random chance. Aside from this, the first boss's cast of Mortal Ray, the Doomcast, has gotten a significantly longer cast time, and since the boss is stunnable, it is now very easy to prevent the boss from using this mechanic altogether, which is a huge shame. In my eyes, the rework should have made the cast instant so there was no way of preventing it. The main change of the final boss is that the Mithril Verges, instead of just shooting at you slowly for ages, speed up their casts with each fire now, and at a certain stack count explode for actually significant raid-wide damage, making them more important targets. The bit where the boss requires a player to lock themselves in with a Verge has also been replaced with all 4 players getting chained to a Verge that will one-shot you if you don't kill it in time. Which is not that hard, but I mean, it is a DPS check of sorts. Considering how often Verges got ignored entirely in the old version, I think the rework of this fight is ultimately for the better. The speeding up casts also feel pretty interesting and new. Cutter's Cry, reworked in 7.3. The Oasis section between the first and second boss used to be entirely skippable, as the shifting sands at the ends of the room were present and usable immediately. Run through mobs and click the thing. Since the menu would instantly close upon taking damage, this could be extremely frustrating if you were even a moment too slow. The rework now requires a certain number of packs to be dealt with before you can proceed. The first two bosses have gotten relatively minor adjustments, with the first one summoning more waves of adds as the fight progresses, and the big add that covers her now is mandatory to kill, where before, you could just brute force kill the boss. The second boss seemingly burrows more frequently. The final boss now runs to the center before sending the chasing lightning orb, and had its persistent ice AoE replaced with some targeted circle AoEs called Lightning Storm. The Oasis skip has, for years, been suggested to be a strange oversight, so adjusting it may have been for the best. Having about a third of a dungeon be entirely skippable in this particular way might also seem a bit wasteful. On the other hand, tricks like this allow players to feel like they master duties, similar to how packs in certain dungeons can be skipped by carefully sneaking around them. For the final boss change, the only justification I have heard for this one is that the duty support NPCs have trouble handling randomly placed persistent AoEs, as they seem perfectly fine with persistent AoEs that appear at fixed spots in higher level duties. Considering that Holminster Switch has a somewhat randomly placed persistent AoE, I don't know if this is truly the case, but if it is, I certainly find it a shame that the solution was no random persistent AoEs. But I guess this mechanic tends to come up super late anyway, so not that much was lost, ? Stone Vigil, from the 6.1 sweep. The final boss specifically had the persistent AoE effect of the circles during the flybys removed, which removed an interesting strategic element from the fight. The best justification is the same as for Cutter's Cry. The second boss, on the other hand, was massively reworked. Originally, Iskibin, the final boss, would fire raid-wide AoEs at you from outside until you shot at it with one of the stationary cannons. This may sound familiar for Stone Vigil Hard. And the boss itself would sometimes summon persistent tornadoes on random player locations, which absolutely could block you off entirely from accessing a specific cannon if planned poorly. Supposedly, Iskibin's raid wides couldn't hurt you if you were standing right up against the entrance to the room, so parties started simply doing that, and placing the persistent tornadoes away when targeted, turning it into a weird kind of DPS race. Most of Koshei's other actions were unchanged. I think that the tornado rework we got, where it became a completely different yet distinctly new and interesting mechanic, is way better than both Brayflox Longstop, Cutter's Cry, and Iskibin's cases. Don't just remove a mechanic or replace it with something super basic, replace it with something that is also new and interesting. For instance, the Chimera from Cutter's Cry could have received the smaller circular arena treatment, and then the persistent AoE mechanic could have been reworked to a mechanic where, as the fight progresses, the boss gradually blocks off quadrants of the arena with persistent AoE. That would definitely be a much more drastic change to the boss fight, but there's an example of how this mechanic could definitely be preserved in a new way that even the duty support NPCs would be able to handle, if that was a problem. Dzemael Darkhold, reworked in 7.4. All of the Magitech terminals are gone. Any doors they access are just open by default, except for the one in the room after the second boss. All-Seeing Eye no longer harasses you in the corridors and just waits for you in the boss room, but all of the packs are still there, unchanged, making one of the easiest gigapulls ever invented into one of, if not the hardest in the game, should you choose to take that challenge. The room after the second boss with the two terminals instead has rounded up all the mobs that were in the room and rearranged them as two packs. Once both packs are slain, the door opens. Personally, I think the terminals were a very interesting detail in the dungeon. However, without the crystal light and the eye to make things more complicated, the terminals would just kinda be there and feel like a waste of time for no reason. The first third of the dungeon always have had optional side corridors that the eye didn't visit, allowing you to hide to let it pass as to not hurt you, but just saying, I have never seen anyone do that. Just hide in the crystal light. Or don't, the AoE doesn't kill you. Similarly, the crystal light was so mad overpowered that it made all those mobs feel kinda redundant as long as you did it right. Speaking of which, before the rework, the first boss was invulnerable while not in the crystal light, and only really did its raid-wide AoE and a frontal cone gaze mechanic, while summoning adds here and there. Again, the crystal light made all of it do basically nearly no damage. Originally, the fight would go on long enough that you had to move to other crystals throughout, but more recently, the boss is consistently beatable in the first crystal. The new version replaces all of that with, you know it, a raid-wide pattern circles and a line AoE. Surprisingly, no tank buster. Personally, while I agree the old version was a lot more exotic, I think the new version does more. I would have preferred a fight that did something more closely resembling the old fight, but considering how big of a part the crystal light played in it, I can see how that would be difficult. The second boss was changed to use cone AoEs. Its adds produce a lot of avoidable circle AoEs, but still sometimes do unavoidable damage. The boss still has a no warning tank buster in straight punch though. Additionally, the boss enters the room a lot faster, but is now untargetable until it does. The final boss had its void zones in its final phase removed, and the point-blank spin AoE now has a telegraph and a cast time. And similarly, this boss also kept its no-warning tank buster. Considering how exceptionally rare no-warning tank busters are in modern dungeons, and reworked dungeons for that matter, it is really weird these bosses kept theirs. The reason why no warning busters are a bit rough, especially in a dungeon setting, is that it means the only counterplay for the tank is to just blindly use a defensive and hope the boss does the thing on time. You can of course learn the patterns, but this is something more commonly seen in harder, more structured content, and dungeons simply don't take enough investment for most players to bother, so these no warning busters feel more like a sucker punch with little counterplay in these situations. The fact they are exceptionally rare in newer content also just clashes heavily with the justification for why the first boss was reworked to what it is, as a lot of reworked bosses that turn into buster or raid-wide circular AoE and pattern seem to do so because that would be a much simpler version of a modern dungeon boss that don't use no warning tank busters. Overall, I understand why this dungeon was reworked in the way that it was, as many of its unique mechanics just made it feel awkward and alien next to other duties, and due to power creep also largely made them feel irrelevant. I would most definitely have preferred if the terminals and crystal light had at least been included in the new version somehow. For example, the first terminal that opens an entirely optional room could just have stayed as it was. It would not have affected the progress of the duty. And with all the optional side paths in the dungeon, how about putting some crystal light there so the really sneaky players can go, oh, you're worried about this gigapull? Check this out. And there it is, the crystal light of godhood. This would both leave some part of these removed features in the duty, but also leave something for players to find. And finally, Aurum Vale, also reworked in 7.4. The yellow goop has, in every room it was in, moved away from the main path and the areas you would be fighting in. Often, the same goop can be found in the corners of the room instead. This does make the dungeon look weird and wrong, but practically speaking, once you learn the goop does damage, you just don't step in it anymore. And only take damage from it if a tick happens to take place right when you pass over it. Admittedly, it did make for slightly more strategic positioning in rooms to not get tripped up by it, but ultimately, it mostly punished first-timers. Some packs, especially in the more central part of the first room in the dungeon, seem to have been removed or just moved. Any patrols also seem to patrol in much smaller areas than before, making which mobs you end up pulling much more consistent. If you use the common approach for the duty, lean left, you will pull roughly the same mobs you did before the rework. Actually, you might get an extra pack of plants. The room before the second boss had one side pack and the patrol removed. The other side pack was placed in the center instead. The packs after the second boss have been slightly slimmed down with the patrol entirely removed too. The room with the two marbles also has way less pods now. For the most part, the pack changes aside from the very first room are pretty nothing burger for me, as it still results in you pulling roughly the same amount you usually do anyway. The first room being slimmed down, on the other hand, may have changed a lot on what can be considered optimal. Although, to be fair, before the rework, the reason we always leaned left is because the sheer concentration of mobs in the rest of the room made it simply pointless to even try anything else. Slimming down the other parts of the room in this way means that you could potentially explore other paths. Although, right at the entrance to the boss room is a toad, ranged plants, and some jellyfish things, and most of them are so closely bunched together that any path through the room you could choose to try results in you pulling them too, so choice without choice, maybe? You might be able to dodge the mushrooms on the left though. For the first boss, it now has a cast time on its tank buster, making it much easier to handle. Furthermore, the fruits in the room have fixed positions and don't despawn when used. Using them incurs a 20-second cooldown where you can't use them again. As far as I can see, the existence of a cast time on the tank buster makes the rest of the fight progress slower, not to mention, it eats at least one auto attack from the boss each time. Perhaps this caveat should have been considered when adding the cast time to make sure the boss still gets through its other mechanics in time. A bonus fun fact is that the boss will only queue up its tank buster when in range of its target, meaning, hypothetically, if you run away from the boss while it casts something else, it has to chase you down, choose to tank buster, and then chase you down again to deliver it. Pretty funny. I would say with the greater presence of fruits in the room, making the boss dish out debuff stacks way more frequently would have been a no-brainer to me. For the final boss, its Vine Probe tank buster now has a more clear cast and will chase you down to deliver it, but unlike Locksmith, does not need to be in range to choose to do so. I also think the single target burr mechanic has had its damage reduced, not to mention the slightly longer Vine Probe cast may also have slowed down the fight similar to Locksmith. The fruits also work the same way as on Locksmith. Overall, I think the changes are alright, but definitely made the duty easier. The change of making fruits abundant and only limiting how often you can use them, I feel, requires adjusting how the debuffs work themselves. The original fight was about carefully managing the few fruits you got to survive the mechanic. Now, you have a fruit every 20 seconds if you want one, the challenge is more in taking the time to use the fruits frequently, so the bosses could dish out way more stacks. Each stack could be proportionally less impactful, but then have them build very fast, so you have to eat frequently. In other words, my main gripe is that the rework of the fights didn't really take into account that one specific change to one thing affected how other parts in a fight are impacted. Final thoughts. I think, for many of the dungeons, changing a boss fight from basically a souped-up normal mob with no mechanics to having some basic mechanics, including a tank boss or a raid wide, is a solid move, especially when we consider that these duties are essentially introductory levels that really should teach you what to expect in future duties. In some cases, like with Haukke Manor or Copperbell Mines, where a boss fight with a lot of adds in them gets simplified to just a boss, I do feel it kind of destroys the whole idea of the fight, and that it would have been a superior rework if the adds in the fight had been included in some way still. At the same time though, a majority of dungeons at higher levels boil down to single boss, so in a way, it would make more sense for the introductory duties to focus on teaching you that, and then focus on the now weirder ideas at the top end, where players should already be equipped to handle it or get good. On the other hand, duties that are actually optional, like Halatali, Cutter's Cry, Dzemael Darkhold, and Aurum Vale, should be allowed to have super weird mechanics, as they are not part of the, one could say, intended path of a new player. You chose to go off track, so here you go, weirdness. On top of all this, using all of these leveling dungeons as teaching tools seems absolutely inane. I know it's a really long game, but it is a game that we're playing. The tutorial has to end somewhere. That said, I do think the changed versions of duties line up well enough with the kinds of duties we see elsewhere in the game, and had these duties looked like this as their initial original forms in 2.0, we might instead be having a conversation about how some of the bosses seem like a weird miss on design. For instance, the slime blob in Copperbell Mines had a whole split the slime into smaller bits mechanic. Now it just shoots tiny bits off to explode for some reason. Amandine, the Grand Lady of the Manor, mostly fights on her own and just briefly brings in a servant to help. What? She should be bringing the whole house to her quarters to help her. Odd things like that. Finally, I also find it very odd that the very first 2 dungeons a new player will meet are entirely unchanged, considering how this means Zastasha is filled with auto-attacker bosses and no warning tank busters, and thingies to interact with ads. Tamtara summons waves of ads and has bosses that mostly just auto-attack. Like, a lot of the things other dungeons weren't allowed to have, these first 2 gets to have? Zastasha even has a little puzzle at the start of the dungeon with an item on the ground telling you the answer, which is not really a common thing in dungeons. Overall, some of the dungeon changes were outright good, others less so. So if I were to grade the ARR Leveling dungeon reworks, I would give it a 6.5 out of 10, a little bit over mid. Now, one super last thing I want to add is that another angle to this whole thing with weird low-level dungeons is that all of these dungeons are in the early stages of the game where dungeons are just by existing more exotic. The pull-in from Toto-Rak might actually be outright scary to a new player. Bosses being like puzzles makes them have a bit more staying power and be a bit more memorable, and by the time bosses start to really turn into the modern style, the new player might have already reached a point where they might not be so interested in a puzzle every time they get a new dungeon, and just want to fight and use their more elaborate toolkit at this higher level. The quote-unquote issue is of course that these puzzly duties also exist in roulettes, so the players that have done the puzzles dozens of times already might quickly get tired of dealing with new players needing to figure it out. Not me, personally. I think it would be fun, but I'm not everyone. So this also could cause some friction, and I have a whole separate video on how a lot of design in 14 seems to focus on avoiding friction these days. Find it in the description if you're interested. But, with that said, what do you think? Do you think the dungeon reworks were all amazing? Or do you feel like the devs are destroying all of your favorite dungeons? Maybe something in between? Be sure to let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, this is not the first time Dzemael Darkhold was changed significantly. At some point in Shadowbringers, the section after the first boss, with the toad in it, had a whole lower floor removed. Originally, you could fall down into that lower floor, and while you could run back up, usually it meant certain death if you fell down into the mobs waiting for you. This change is also likely why, with the recent Dzemael rework, that this section of the duty is entirely unchanged.